Good evening. We're on time, we're moisturized, we're ready. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jen Sungshine here with my dear friend and longtime creative partner, David Ng. And we want to welcome you to Yellow Peril, Reimagining Queer Asian Futures. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we're gathered here today from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Part of being queer Asian artists working towards queer futurity means also working in solidarity with ongoing Indigenous struggles for sovereignty, decolonization, reparations, and land back.
So tonight we're screening 3 films. We're going to keep this intro very short because we have some films to get through. First, we're going to start with Richard Fung's Reorientations, which is about an hour. And then we're going to screen Yellow Peril, Queer Destiny, the first film, and a special premiere of the 2 bonus chapters, Yellow Peril, Queer Futures. So the total runtime for both those films is around 32 minutes. Don't forget to stay behind for a special Q&A with Dr. Helen Leung and Kendell Yan, aka Maiden China. Before we begin, I just want to thank Vancouver Pride Society for sponsoring this event. I think this is the first Pride event for Vancouver Pride. I'm just going to claim that. Kicking off Pride at
You can tell David's a Leo because he loves to be first in everything.
Kicking off Pride with some Asian pride. And also thank you to the SFU's Van City Office of Community Engagement, Canada Council for the Arts, BC Multiculturalism, Canadian Heritage, and BC Arts Council for their support. I also just want to give a special thank you to Christian Jones, who collaborated with us to make this follow-up film. His beautiful artistry is what has made this film, I think, so special. So please enjoy the films. As they're getting settled, so just in terms of format, we're just going to have maybe like a 10-minute chat between the 4 of us, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So.
I also just want to acknowledge everyone's been sitting for a very long time, so do what you need to do to stretch, to feel comfortable. If you need a bio break, you're grown-ups, you can take care of yourself. How do we want to start this off? Did you want to read the bio?
Oh, oops.
Here.
Thank you. Yes, let me introduce our guests. Dr. Helen Leung is a professor and chair in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, my former undergrad professor, and co-director of the Institute for Transpacific Cultural Research at Simon Fraser University. She has published widely on Asian cinemas and queer cultural productions and is the author of 2 books. She also co-edits the HKUP Queer Asia book series and hosts the podcast Transpacific Stories. She's currently working on a SSHRC-funded research project on Transpacific Film Cities. So welcome, Helen. Thank you. Kendell, or Maiden China, is a trans femme non-binary feminist drag performance artist. Her interdisciplinary practice explores the concept of the hyphen, liminal states of embodied being, and incorporates elements of classical Chinese opera, queer theory, resistance politics, and intimate contact performance art. They perform regularly as a member of the House of Rice, an all-Asian drag family in Vancouver, BC, as well as one of the Darlings, a non-binary drag collective. So welcome to Kendell and Helen.
Let's give them a huge round of applause. Come on.
Jen, do you want to kick us off with
Yes,
the first
so
question?
I will start us off with a couple of questions for Helen and for Kendell. But I also just kind of want to say how incredible it is to actually sit in a theater, in a cinema, immersing myself with people around me. I haven't been to an actual theater in a few years. And just to share that collective laughter with all of you it's just really meaningful to me and to David, I'm sure. But yeah, I want to start us off with quite of a general question, maybe to Helen, and then pass it on to Kendell, which is, watching Reorientations, Richard Fung's incredible work, and then followed by Yellow Peril Queer Destiny, and then Yellow Peril Queer Futures. What overarching theme did you kind of observe, or any insights that emerged for you?
Well, I have to say I have many feels watching these two films together, and I'll maybe just give two quick responses. One to do with place and one to do with time. I think I've seen reorientations in Vancouver a few times, and every time in the audience I would hear people say, well, we have very similar histories. There's a parallel scene and a parallel queer Asian history. How come we don't have any documentation? And so there's always that conversation. So I think for me, it's a real treat to see Yellow Peril. This is the biggest screen I've seen it on, and it's stunning. It's visually amazing. And I think you have really captured Maiden China's artistry, and through that, bring out a lot of the nuance and complex issues around queer Asian activism in Vancouver. So I feel like for me, that you are kind of answering the call that a lot of us have when we watch Reorientations. The second response I have is, I have known David and Jen since we were a generation younger, I think. So it's always strange to me to hear you talk about the younger generations. and of course, a lot of the people in Richard's films I see as my queer elder, right? So it was interesting for me I realized seeing these films together and being with you all here together, that generations don't have to be linear, right? That you talk about future, but I think my feeling here today is kind of, generations are kind of concurrent, and there's a kind of, we can think it concurrently rather than in a linear way. So that's my initial response.
I love it.
Yeah, one thing that jumped out to me was, I think it was one of the last interviews, I forget the name for the person in Reorientations, but this idea around organizing around Asian identity and that identitarianness, and what does that mean? And I think that that's sort of what came out when we made the new film too, about, and one of the reasons why we made the new film was because, shortly after premiering the first film in 2019, the world, shifted quite dramatically around us. But, what does it mean to organize or around queer Asian identity? And I think that was an interesting connection that is still bubbling in my mind.
Yeah, for me, I think I've seen Reorientations a few times, and sorry, my voice is even like a little wavery now. I get very weepy watching it because I feel so grateful for the similarities and the parallels of what I'm experiencing in my lifetime, that people who are my elders and these generations that are not linear, that so much of what I inhabit is thanks to people who have been doing this for decades. And I forget also there's a part in it where they're talking about the differences of the younger generation opening up more to vulnerability, and that is like the entire epicenter of what I do in my artistic practice. And so I can see that is just like a constant conversation throughout all of this, and the differences. So yeah, I just like sit quietly in the corner and cry to Reorientations. It's so moving, yeah.
Sorry, I lost my questions because I don't have my clipboard.
Oh, sorry. Well, why don't we have another question I think this one's for Helen. So, we kind of put this panel together to be an intergenerational panel. What was your experience with queer Asian activism in the late 90s and early 2000s? When Jen and I were thinking about this question, we were like, well, I think we have the tendency to frame our generation's activism as the most radical and critical. But we know, obviously, as Kendell, you just said so eloquently, like, we know that's not the case. And we know that, what was built from the foundation of generations before. So
I think it's okay to feel that way. It's in the nature of being young to feel radical, and so it's good.
Rock on.
I feel like I'm kind of the in-between generation, because I a little bit younger than the people in reorientations and obviously older than you. When I first arrived in Vancouver was in the late 90s, and I think some of you the younger people would feel that it's so strange because I found Queer Asians by looking at an ad, literally in the paper copies of the Georgia Strait. So I was new in town, I saw an ad that says, Monsoon, a social and political group for lesbian and bisexual Asian women of Vancouver, with a telephone number, a landline number. So all I did was call that number, and I was given a date and time and the address of a coffee house, I remember, just off Commercial and Charles. And that's it, and I went, and when I went, there were like these groups of like amazing, queer women from very different Asian backgrounds. And they would just be like telling me, oh, we'd go out for dim sum, we would make, invite you to make zines with us, and we did poetry reading. And I think the most formative form of activism for me at that time was in 2002. We were involved in this 3-day-long cultural festival called Lotus Roots. And I knew at that time that it was already the 3rd iteration. And it was completely volunteer-run, which was very impressive. I don't know if we can do it these days. It was run by, at that time, the executive director of Asia Society for the Intervention of AIDS, Asia, which was very much, you see it in orientation, like around AIDS education for migrant families, right? But it was overlapped, the people working at Asia overlap a lot with people in queer Asian activism. And so the executive director just got a grant, and then I think we only hired one person who is a paid position, and then all volunteers come together and make this festival happen. So I feel like at that time, the activism was a lot about just making community together without a lot of kind of institutional interventions. Like, you just kind of make do. And I feel like at that time, there were two kind of issues that we were dealing with. One was it's the first emergence of trans inclusion. So there was a lot of discussion around transness within the Asian community. And the second was Asia itself, because I think we were at that time very aware that Asian in Vancouver often means East Asian. And then there was a real intentionality to kind of decenter that. So we had a lot of talk about why is it that South Asian prefer to organize amongst themselves? Why is it that queer Muslims group don't really want to hang out with the queer Asian crowd? So we did a lot of outreach that way, which I thought was actually in some ways radical in that way, because it doesn't, which is why I disagree a bit with Judy Han, that it doesn't have to be identitarian, that in fact, organizing around queer Asian can exactly be questioning the essentialism of identity. And so for that part, I feel like it was very inspiring for me, and it really affected my work later as a queer scholar. And we have fun. Yeah. Lots of sticky rice relationships.
I feel like that, the looseness or the fluidity of the boundaries that you're talking of too is, I see parallels with how Kendell talks about, your embodiment of art and your embodiment as Maiden China. I'm wondering if you can speak more to the end there where you're talking about that gap has closed. I just wanted to kind of hear more from you around that gap closing.
Yeah, I mean, well, when we were filming the new chapters and we put the DVD in, we watched Yellow Peril. It just struck me that I think over the last couple years, so much of my life has changed internally, because I think I owe a lot of it to my transition, and in recognizing so much of my, the wholeness of my identity that I was rejecting subconsciously, and how healthy that has been for me, in my mind. And of course, that is reflected in everything I do, in all of my relationships, in the art that I make, and in the community that I participate in. Watching it was just sort of, it's like those moments of just being like, oh, right, like I'm constantly changing and things are actually getting better, and it sounds so cheesy, but it is true for me, at least. I have that privilege, and yeah.
And it turns out you're really funny.
It turns out I'm funny, yeah. Over Zoom, who knew?
And I love that too, because one of the things and this is like really shared here in this space as well, is, you know, you speaking about joy and the kind of the joy also that's felt in reorientation in those people, on the faces of the people revisiting, you know, themselves 30 years ago, the kind of like revisiting like the almost the kind of like, oh, I was so kind of cringe when I was young, or the awkwardness that comes with just like growing up and learning and, you know, but there's a joy in that as well, in that kind of like, just, you know, embodying who you are. That's part of who you are. I don't necessarily know if there's a question here, but I'm wondering if, yeah, maybe we can have a discussion around what joy looks like for you in 2022. And I'm going to try to combine that with another question, which is, I think, you know, I think a lot about emergency preparedness because of this apocalyptic kind of doom that I often feel. And I guess in the kind of interest of an intergenerational conversation, does every generation have its own apocalyptic doom, dystopian, what have you? I don't know.
Is living just dystopic doom?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. There's no question there. Just wanted to talk about apocalypse and joy.
I think joy looks like a lot of different things to me in this year, in this present moment. A big thing that I have learned is I don't have to know everything to participate in things. And that's like a lot of anxiety that I think I would have brought to the screening in 2019 when we did it the first time, was like, I'm going to sit on this panel and watch this documentary about myself as though I have all the answers to everything about anti-Asian racism. And that's just not the case, and I very clearly do not. But I don't need to. And so, like, joy of just like releasing that ego thing, the joy of setting boundaries has been really lovely. Saying no to things when I don't have the capacity to. Allowing myself to be funny, as I said in there. Yeah. I think it's just like really simple things. It sounds like such a Hallmark thing to say, but joy to me, I think, can just be like so simple as just like saying hello to your friends when you're in a lockdown and like calling them on the phone. I hate talking on the phone, but that was something that I was just like, you know what, I can just do that, and I can like connect with someone and like allow us to have that moment. Yeah.
What about you, Helen?
I think that's a great reminder, because from what I see in my OH, there's a lot of burnout in activism circle. And so I think just even remembering that there should be joy in the work that you're doing, however heavy it becomes, and that there's a joy of connection, of like being together, expressing solidarity, remembering, all of that should be joyful. And so I think that part is not just optional. I think it's really crucial, essential. Yeah.
And what does joy look like for you personally, Helen?
Being here. I think I'm starting, like when you're just kind of turning 50, you start, I remember friends telling me this when he was turning 50, that you start to not just look ahead. And that is a very strange sensation. So I guess for me now, which is why I said about the concurrence, because looking back can feel melancholy and kind of sad. But I think like when you have generations together, there is something very joyful about that, about like sharing. So it's not just about slowly going towards an end. And it's not just looking back at things that are lost, right? But like kind of, and maybe, I don't know if you like, maybe we want to be more in a speculative, you were talking about alien, right? Like think of different kinds of dimension of being that isn't like linear moving towards, what did you say, catastrophe. And I think that to find that could be joyful, and that should be very queer.
Yes. Thank you.
Maybe we'll do one more question and then open it up to the floor.
Yeah.
This one's actually kind of, it came from a conversation that we had with you, Helen. So social media has really shifted how marginalized communities self-represent through art and digital presence. Can you talk a little bit about what local queer Asian activism looked like in the late 90s and early 2000s?
Before social media.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that is probably one huge difference, I think. I think in the world before social media, everything is a lot slower. So much more deliberate. I would say two things, much slower and more private. So then, like in the arts, I have definitely witnessed a lot of conflict within community, even just within queer Asian activists in Vancouver, right? But those conflicts don't really go outside of, say, a meeting, or even outside several telephone conversations. And so the outcome of those conflicts can sometimes lead to more complexity and greater things. And so I think there's more of a comfort with discomfort, because it's okay if we don't agree, because it's okay, we can talk and keep working on it. Whereas I think after social media, that is almost impossible, because a conflict would just become global the next hour. And so there's, I think, less comfort with discomfort, because you want to, it's more about, I'm not sure, I don't want to describe it, but that's the kind of feeling I get, is in terms of speed and the publicness of everything. And I think then it results in maybe a different kind of activism and a different kind of feelings amongst folks. So, yeah, but I don't think we can do without social media, so.
I'm curious, Kendell, this is a slightly pivoted question, but we've had conversations about, excuse me, as a performer, I mean, I'm gonna, obviously performing through Zoom is a very different medium, but I'm curious, like, what has been, what have you sort of witnessed because you've talked quite a bit about having to go digital. What has that experience been like?
I actually really loved digital performances for a number of reasons. And I think that one of the biggest reasons is that as long as you have, of course, like a computer or a phone and an internet connection, it's so accessible to a wider variety of people who either have like physical barriers to accessing space or financial barriers to accessing space, but also like not having to leave my home. As much as I know most of us wanted to during like a full lockdown, for myself who struggles with social anxiety and depression, and being able to be like, I'm not gonna wear shoes to perform today, and it's just gonna be to my computer and my boyfriend. That was really comforting and quite nice. And I think you could also reach like a huge audience. I did a show that was Untitled Queen, who's a performance artist based in Brooklyn, did Untitled World, and so there was sort of like one performer from as many countries as possible, and that's like the kind of reach and online space that you can't have physically. It is impossible. I mean, unless you fly everyone out, but even then, it's still slightly different. Yeah, I guess there's also like a sense of immediacy that is different than in a physical space, but then also the physical space has a different sense of immediacy than online. I guess it's kind of, yeah, it's interesting, that paradox, but.
Thank you. Should we take questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yes, we have
Questions from the
a
audience.
runner with a mic.
Got another one. So many questions. Okay.
There's one up there is the first hand I saw.
Okay.
Oh, we're going to have to do this in order.
I'll go here.
Now, who came first?
Mine is a quick one. First, Maiden, is there any significance for your incredible claws?
These ones here on my hands, or the ones in the film?
It's like you take it to another level.
Well, so the claw covers that I have in the film, I've used for quite a while in drag. Obviously, it's quite a dramatics, but there is a history of them in like dynastic periods in China of nobility wearing those like long finger coverings. It's some of like the oldest known uses of nail extensions, essentially. I mean, there are quite a few different cultures that use them as well, but so that's kind of like the cultural relevance, but it's very dramatic, which I like, and fits the alien aesthetic that we talked
We love
about.
drama, if you
We
can't
love
tell from
a
the film.
drama.
Hi, my name is Denise. So my question is, so I'm a theater major here at SFU, and I just wanted to ask you, how do you find the balance between creating with joy and creating pieces that are stemmed from trauma? Because we are very encouraged to like step into our identities, and I feel like a lot of that being like surrounded by queer BIPOC folks, we tend to create a lot of things from trauma. So like, how do you and you talk about that in the documentary too. So like, how do you find, like, just throwing in like being funny in like a traumatic piece, let's say, or just like just finding just a little tiny joy in like making a piece like that?
Yeah, I'm like, I'm hurting, ha ha. I'm not really quite sure if I've 100% found that the balance, but I think it's sort of like I think I just have a negotiation with myself. Say if I get booked for a show and I think about a number of things ranging from how am I going to be feeling on that day and what do I want to take on personally, to who is going to be in the audience and who would benefit from seeing something that would maybe be a bit more centered around like identity that is informed through trauma or through suffering, I guess, or through hurt. Yeah, I don't know if I have a way to answer that question, but I think it is just like a constant negotiation with myself about, and I think going back to that thing about joy and centering, making myself feel comfortable, I think I put the first question is, how am I going to be feeling? And what do I want to like take on for myself? Whereas I think previously I might have shelved that at the end and thought that my responsibility to bleed for an audience comes before my own well-being. You know, obviously that's a dramatic metaphor, but
But it's also making me think about, like, you know, I mean, I'm not a performance artist, but like a lot of when Jen and I apply for grants, there's a push or an underlying kind of demand for like trauma porn from especially racialized folks and other marginalized communities as well, and you know, we of course are drawing on our own traumas, if you will, if in this film too, but it also has to come from a place where it comes from us too. So setting up those sort of like boundaries and also places that are, you know, as you're alluding to, like safe and comfortable for us to actually draw from it in a good way that's not gonna also cause us a lot of terrible feelings too, right? Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think a little bit of like as artists, if you're finding yourself being constantly in a state of being triggered, then that's kind of a reminder that, you know, there's some work that needs to be done internally, right? That you can't project that onto other people and make other people do that work for you. So that's kind of towing the line there for me, anyways. Any
Hi.
next question?
Yes, here.
Oh, hi.
Let's see.
So I recently spent some time back in China, where's my hometown, and I remember some of my queer friends asked me, where do the lesbians hang out or the queer hang out in Vancouver? And
Oh my
I
God.
realized I couldn't give them an answer. In terms of a space, and also it was reflected in the film. They talk about like probably more in the new generation, there's probably not a physical space. And I also heard a lot of laughter from the audience, and I felt like, okay, maybe that's some kind of agreement. And I think in reorientation, when I heard about these struggle back in the days, I actually felt that the same in China. You know, like recently, one of the big news was that someone was holding LGBTQ plus flags in university campus, and they got punished by the university. They got expelled. And that's just still really vivid in my engagement in China, my home. And it's just when I'm back here, I also am in search of community. Like when I hear, sorry, I lost. I'm just curious. My question is, I'm just curious in terms of the space, people's engagement in Vancouver. What is it like? I have that question for myself too. In like, other than comedy shows or performances, is there a way, like, is there places people sit down and actually talk and to
Well, that's actually, that's an interesting question, and Jen and I were invited to a Facebook Messenger group, but it was a really, it was on trying to start sort of a queer Asian resource / support network. And there was some folks in Toronto that were also trying to encourage this conversation. And we were talking similar to things that you're bringing up, like sort of where are those spaces? And because there's definitely a community that could respond or need those sources. But, it unfortunately fizzled, that conversation.
And I think the digital, while it enables a different kind of community, then has taken the urgency out of making physical space, right? So I think it's interesting when I think in Vancouver there were always a lot more gay bars than lesbian spaces. There are almost very, very few lesbian spaces. But there's a documentary about a bar called the Portside that was, I think, would be from the orientation generation. In the 90s, we would go dancing at the Lava Lounge. Does anybody remember the Lava Lounge on Granville? That would be women's night in Lotus Hotel. So there were those sporadic, temporary spaces. And I came from Hong Kong, and then I know in the 90s and 2000s in Hong Kong, there were a lot of these upstairs kind of coffee house spaces and bookstore spaces that queers hang out, right? So you would make physical space, not when you don't have the commercialized space. But I think now, because you so easily form a Facebook group, you just don't do it because it's harder. So I think the answer is, unfortunately, you have to find it online first, and then maybe you create the physical space after that.
Yeah. Well, it used to be Commercial Drive, where all the women would hang out.
I've heard the choices on Commercial Drive. Great. No joke.
Wow.
Also a lot of bike shops. So if you wanna,
Hardware store, I heard.
yeah, hardware stores as well.
It depends on who you're looking for.
Yes. But yeah.
That's true, actually. We are
There
that
you
space.
go. That's right. Go mingle amongst yourselves.
Yeah, we'll give you some privacy. No.
I think volunteering, that's another thing. Like volunteering for organizations, organizing can be a meeting space as well. So,
Any other questions?
Thank you. Hello, I'm Melissa. Generationally speaking, I'm second generation mixed race Filipinx, immigrant and settler. And some of the tensions and themes that came out in both sets of films was this question about colonialism and, of course, settler colonialism here. And the railroad poem, visual art, performance was so moving. And the Canadian Pacific Railroad was, of course, a mechanism of settler colonialism. So I'm curious about how you in academic work, in art, are making those intersections with our shared, of course, colonial histories differing in Asia and colonialisms that are manifesting here. And thank you so much for making this space and the art and the work.
Well, what's coming to mind is, just a little bit of background actually to how this second film was even made. When Jen and I started noticing over the past 2 years a lot of attention to anti-Asian racism, and we were like, we are going to take this white guilt money and we're going to apply for it all.
We went on a tour,
But
raking it in.
But then we were settled with this this dilemma of how do we actually, as I sort of alluded to before, talk about anti-Asian racism without just making it a demand for recognition that because in and of itself, this demand for recognition, if we don't sort of address the structural thing, it's just colonialism, right? And so one of the things, so this grew out of, so we organized what was supposed to be a 2-week art and culture symposium called Bitter Orientals, Yellow Peril Unmasked. And it was supposed, this screening, which was prior to the decision to make the follow-up to the film, was supposed to be this conversation. So there was panels on abolition of police and prisons, decolonization, and then this reorientations and Yellow Peril were going to be screened. Where was I going? Right, and this has definitely been a struggle for us. When we were like, how do we actually continue? What do we do in this moment that isn't just sort of reinforcing these types of things? And so this is how this project grew out of. We decided, when we had a conversation with Kendell about it, the implications of the original film all of a sudden today have different meanings, and so we wanted to sort of revisit the film. But that question that you asked is definitely something that's pretty huge on our minds.
Well, I feel like the tension that I feel in terms of being, in my scholarship, I work mostly on queer work space in Asia. And so even I co-edited that book series, was all about finding queer Asian work base in Asia. And so that it's a very different context than the anti-Asian racism we see in North America. And I think that we have to kind of be intentional about mindful of the two, because I think in the face of anti-Asian racism, the racism only sees Asian as the same, right? And so the solidarity, like Kendall was talking about, then you want to respond as a community and in solidarity. But then at the same time, that almost forces you to erase the difference and the complex geopolitical history within Asia itself. And there are different empires, there are different interlocking oppressions. So I always wonder, how do we hold the two together? And it's very difficult, because I even find sometimes, when you talk about, I have colleagues who work on Xinjiang and Tibet, and for them, Chinese colonialism is like first in mind, but then when you do that, that gets hijacked by anti-Chinese racism here, right? So how do we hold that imbalance? How do we even talk about that? Let alone being queer in those spaces, right? Yeah. So I guess I would say it's hard, but we must work at articulating that and maybe be alert to what context we're speaking about those things. Yeah. But then I think in art, maybe you can find the solution, because, right, it's in the emotion.
I don't have the solution.
I actually, in art, it's like much better than, because you don't have to talk about it or articulate those, because you're kind of bringing your joy and bringing a certain emotions. And do you find that? Because you don't have to spell it out the way one has to in scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, it's like this part in this panel answering this question where I'm like, I have no idea how to answer this question. Because what I do is I wrote that poem and I produced the physical visual of being on that railroad track and having these lovely filmmakers, that's like my answer to the question, I guess, in some ways. I guess is what you're getting at is, in art, I think there's a certain
space for the complexity to emerge emotionally, and open a space for conversation, whereas when you have to spell it out, it's like it can be painful and can be harder. So I would say, make art. Don't do scholarship.
Also pay artists. God damn it. Pay artists.
So it's 8:48. Maybe we have time for one more question? You guys have been a very patient audience.
One more. I also just want to give people the permission to leave. It's been a couple of hours. You've been sitting on your butts. It's okay. We won't be offended.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You guys talk about very macro level of, Chinese, North America. For me, I see this cross intergenerational where I'm 62, my son is 31, my parents just recently died. And when a son came out to you on top of what you're dealing of being a minority in a country, you feel like, oh my God, my how I'm gonna communicate and connect with my son who think I'm being too loud if I talk about this in the public, right? He's a very private person. So if he knows I'm asking this question, I don't know how we feel about it. And there seems to be a differences between those who come from a family who's very open, North American, and accepting, to that, that's still very Asian and very, like maybe I would say 60 or 80 years ago, North America, where there's a lot of still misunderstanding about, I myself don't know too much about, I need to be educated about what this LGBT issue is like. So what I'm trying to say is that if that brings you to estrangement to your relationship with your son, and you feel like I can't really talk about it not only with my family, and if I talk about it with my son, I just feel like I'm fear about it's gonna making it worse between me and my son. So what I'm talking about is that long distance displacement, long distance fracture of the traditional Chinese relationship, or to all of us here who want to have a harmonious relationship with our family. How do one begin to mend for ourselves and for our coming generation? Because I see you say intergenerational. How do we address that, the differences in attitude, where just me standing here talking, someone will feel like, you're just making me feel very uncomfortable.
Thank you.
Asking as a parent.
Is that Jan?
Yes, it's me,
Hi.
Jan.
I can't really see it. Thank you for that question. I was wondering, I think I saw...
Does it make sense what I'm trying to
I think
ask?
a question around like sort of intergenerational communication and understanding. I was wondering, maybe we could take two questions at the same time. Was there a question over here? Oh, yes. Yeah, well, why don't we take those two and then we'll together. Yeah.
Hello, can you hear me? I don't think I have a question as intricate as that person there. I'm so sorry, but I'm Tommy. I watched Yellow Peril, I think it's my third time now, 2 for class. Just want to say it's like really wonderful. I still love the film. My question is directed more towards Helen. I was just wondering what the discourse around HIV/AIDS is like now in the Asian community, and if you're seeing maybe there's some sort of difference in between Asian communities around HIV/AIDS in North America versus Asia. If we're seeing there's more stigma or less stigma for going towards a more kind of like medicalization of queerness. I'm just curious to know what you've seen throughout the years. Yeah.
Maybe just very quickly, I'm not an expert on discourse on AIDS. I have colleagues who are, but I would just say I think in this generation there's more of a there has been more of a disconnection, right, between like dissociation of AIDS to be exclusively with queer communities, and also because now it's seen as a curable disease, I think the stigma has decreased. But I think definitely my own experience in Vancouver during the 90s was that there was a strong connection, right? And a lot of, maybe also bringing it back to Jan's question, as I said, the work of Asian Society for the Intervention of AIDS was in some way very radical in terms of developing an AIDS education that is in different Asian languages and catered towards a language of sex and sexuality and health that can be more readily accepted and understood in those different cultural communities. And in some way, I see a connection between those efforts in the 90s and some of the early works that Love Intersection did. Because I remember you guys did that poster campaign, which I really loved. That was one of your first projects, where you had all these different posters and you don't mention the identity, you don't mention gay, trans, but then you have different languages that talks about, liking cats and wanting to be an engineer, and I think those posters go a long way towards, maybe ensuring a kind of intergenerational harmony and presenting LGBTQ issues in a way that is culturally sensitive, or no, I shouldn't even say culturally sensitive, that the Western language is not the only language to talk about either AIDS education or LGBTQ issue, right? So I do see, what you guys did as well as what Asia did in the 90s went a long way to addressing the more kind of personal, intimate kind of issues that you're talking about.
Thanks, Helen. Also, just want to quickly answer for Jan as well. I think it's never too late to break the cycle. Just a year ago, I heard my very Taiwanese, very Asian dad say to me that I'm proud of you, like he was proud of me. And you never, Asian parents don't say that to their children. So the fact that, and they also, now when we part, when we say goodbye, he comes in for a hug, physical affection. Very strange, very, very strange. But so it's never too late to change, and I can see my parents changing, their wheels turning when I introduce them to my work, show them films. My dad will say, I don't really understand this, but over time, you feel like they kind of are trying to understand you. So, I just don't think it's ever too late, and to have that conversation in different ways that isn't just a straight on, hey, I'm coming out, et cetera, but maybe it's demonstrated through food, maybe it's have you eaten yet, it's those things, yeah. Great.
Thanks, everyone.
And on that note,
thanks for coming on a Wednesday night.
Thank you. It's a Wednesday. You said Monday. Thank you.